Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, fools and flabbergastas, my name is Mason and it's time for another Guild Wars 2 easy and flexible build guide. The goal of this guide is to enable you as much flexibility and low switching costs between PvE game modes on a particular class and elite specialization. This means that whenever possible I will use only one set of gear with slight alterations. In turn, I will usually suggest armor and trinkets that allow for high damage and the necessary defense/support is accommodated for through traits, food and skill changes only. That usually also means that the build is not necessarily always the best in slot choice, but it will pass a certain DPS threshold under the usual raid buffs and get you through pretty much all open world content on your own if needed. Today's class of choice is the Necromancer and the elite specialization is the Harbinger, and we'll be going through 3 different build variants: a condition DPS build, a more resilient open world roamer and a quickness variant. The links to these builds are as always in the description of the video. Before we go into the details, let's talk some pros and cons. The build does great damage with 38k on the golem with a very easy rotation. It's also almost fully ranged, which makes it much easier to handle in a lot of content. Harbinger is also a very good support spec because it's able to supply quickness, fury and might with ease. As one of the downsides, you can say that the build is quite squishy in Shroud, but minions are good punchbacks that you can use to help with that. What can also be quite annoying sometimes is that the build requires you to use mobility skills. And finally, the utilities you use are mostly fixed, because utility changes cost a large chunk of your damage. As a starting point of the guide, let's look at the general playstyle of Harbinger and the skills. So what makes it unique and how can it be played well? As is typical for Necromancers, Harbinger has access to a version of Shroud, Harbinger Shroud. Similarly to all other Necromancer specs, this Shroud requires you to manage life force as well. You generate life force when creatures around you die and through various other means. So in general, the more death occurs around you, the better. Opposed to Core, Necro and Reaper, Harbinger Shroud does not replace your health points with life force, so you will be downed if your health goes to 0 in Shroud. While this sounds like a big downside, it also has advantages in combat. Reaper and Core Necro lose out on good access to Shroud skills under pressure because incoming damage costs life force and thus reduces the time you can remain in Shroud. Harbinger doesn't have that problem, which is nice because you deal good damage even under higher pressure, unless you die of course. As you can already see, Harbinger is a Kiss curse based specialization. Another layer of that is the Blight mechanic. For every stack of Blight on you, you'll lose a share of maximum health, but you also gain offensive benefits like increased damage and heal each second per stack. How do you accumulate Blight and why would you do that? If you use elixirs and remain within the splash area, you'll apply stacks of Blight to yourself. In Shroud, you will also stack up Blight once per second. Aside from the passive damage benefits, Blight can also be consumed to increase the power of some of your Shroud skills and elixirs. This means that you want to use elixirs and Shroud to accumulate Blight and then consume it to empower your Shroud skills. Don't underestimate how impactful doing this is for damage purposes. This, however, also means that the utility choices are pretty much set in stone and we'll have to find other ways to adjust for different situations. But Harbinger, and Necromancer in general, has most things you'd want built into traits anyway, so we can do very well without changing utilities or gear. But more on that later. In general, your Shroud skills are more powerful than anything you can do outside of it, and Shroud brings additional passive benefits, so what we'll do is we'll try to maximize the Shroud uptime to increase damage. As the weapons of choice, you have a bunch of options. The standard benchmark build uses pistol, scepter and dagger, but the standard weapons for us will be pistol, focus and dagger. Pistol will be the default main hand weapon and focus the default offhand weapon. The reason for focus instead of dagger is that it enables us to use a simplified rotation that costs a bit of damage compared to the benchmark, around 7%, but makes the rotation much easier to handle because you don't need to rely on weapon swaps at all. Even though focus isn't exactly a condition weapon, it is the offhand weapon with by far the highest life force generation through Soul Grasp. But why is that important? Harbinger drains life force and Shroud very quickly, at a rate of 5% every second. This means that unless you have a lot of incoming life force from deaths around you, you'll need to actively use skills that generate life force. Since the utility skills and pistol are set in stone, you'll understand why later, the only option you have to do that is the offhand. If you want to have the setup for the benchmark rotation ready to go, you can also add a scepter to this. If you know that the encounter you're dealing with yields a lot of passive life force anyway, so boss fights with many adds or general roaming in open world, you can use a dagger just fine, which is the ideal option for damage in those cases where life force isn't an issue. We'll be going through the skills for Shroud, pistol, focus, dagger and utilities now. The Shroud auto attack Tainted Bolts applies torment and burning with the right trait choices and does a bit of strike damage, both in an area around the enemy. This is a chain of 2 hits, so try to not interrupt it if you can. Especially with the amount of burning it applies, this is much stronger than the auto attack outside of Shroud. Tainted Bolts and Dark Barrage, Shroud skill number 2, have a range of 900. So if you are in a scenario where it's advantageous to stay at range, you can simply only use these off cooldown. Dark Barrage is the bread and butter skill in Shroud. Try to use this as often as possible since it applies a ton of Torment and Poisoned. With Alacrity you can use it 3 times if you delay going off Shroud for a little bit. Its cast time is a bit longer than the cast bar, so try to not cancel this early. This is a cone attack, so it hits more reliably in melee range as well. The next 2 skills are movement skills, and the main reason why Harbinger isn't fully ranged. When used above the respective blight threshold, they are also among the strongest damage skills in the kit. Shroud skill 3 is Devouring Cut. This does a little bit of strike damage and is a charge skill. The skill is only worth casting if you have at least 5 stacks of blight on you, because it only applies the 5 stacks of torment in that case. Otherwise, doing auto attacks is always better. The same applies to Voracious Arc, Shroud skill number 4. With at least 10 stacks of Blight, this skill is the most powerful damaging ability aside from Plague Lance and Blood is Power, because it applies 4 stacks of Torment for 20 seconds. It also dazes the target, so it brings some CC along with high damage. The only downside of it is it's a leap skill that launches you at the target. This can be problematic if positioning is important, particularly if you like to use the action camera mode like I do. Shroud 5 is Vital Draw. This is a very powerful CC skill and it grants life force per target struck. While it isn't useful for damage purposes, it certainly is for breaking CC as it applies a 3-second float. It's a melee skill though, so make sure to stand close to your target when activating it. Moving on to pistol skills. The pistol auto attack Vicious Shot also applies a stack of Torment with the same duration as the Shroud auto and does a little bit of strike damage. In group content you usually don't have a lot of time to actually use this, since using the other skills off cooldown takes up most of the time you have outside of Shroud. Next up we have Weeping Shots, the bread and butter skill with a very short cooldown. It applies 6 stacks of Torment and Vulnerability, and what's very important about this is that it also grants life force for every bullet that hits. You can use this twice outside of Shroud without having to delay Shroud, which you don't want, so you have a bit of wiggle room with it. Pistol 3, Vile Blast, applies a good bit of poison and is also a stun. It's worth it for both the damage and the hard and soft CC it applies. Since this is a powerful ranged CC skill, you can save this for cases when you know it will be required. So far for the 3 pistol skills, all solid for damage with nice little side effects. Next up we have either Dagger or Focus. Let's start with Focus. Soul Grasp is the first focus skill. Aside from Weeping Shots, this is our second source of life force in the damaging rotation. It also siphons some damage and applies 5 stacks of vulnerability, which can be nice in solo situations or as additional group support. Spinal Shivers is a niche skill, since it only does worthwhile damage when you actually remove boons from foes. There are situations where this can be useful, for example on Condemn the Peerless or Veil Guardian. You can also use this as a source of some soft CC, but that typically isn't required. Swapping to the other offhand weapon choice, Dagger. Dagger has 2 very nice skills that fit well into the kit. Deathly Swarm is Dagger skill 4 and it is a condition transfer. This is particularly nice because you can use it to transfer the self-inflicted conditions from your utility skills, we'll get to that later, to the enemy for a chunk of bonus damage. It also does a small amount of damage itself and applies blind, which is always nice to have. Enfeebling Blood is Dagger skill 5 and this is a good damage skill through the bleeding it applies. It will also corrupt a boon on the enemy into a condition, so it has similar applications as Spinal Shivers. The standard set of weapons I have on this is Pistol, Focus and Dagger. Warhorn is also worth a mention here since it grants another great ranged CC skill and long-lasting swiftness, which is nice for open world roaming. Alright, so far for our weapon skills, let's continue with utilities. The utilities are pretty much set in stone for group content, since changing any of them results in a large DPS loss. First off, we got 3 elixirs. You should always use the healing elixir and 2 others, where you can freely choose from the ones with a 25-second cooldown depending on which boons you need. You should also pretty much always run the Quickness elixir, Elixir of Anguish, because it's an essential boon that can be lacking, especially in solo gameplay. Now how do elixirs work? When you throw one, it grants you boons, but only applies 10 stacks of Blight to you when you are in the splash area of it. If you have at least 5 stacks of Blight on you when it's activated, it consumes a few stacks of Blight and doubles its damage and condition duration in return. So the first elixir will apply 10 stacks of Blight, the second and third will apply 10 and consume 5 each. So after casting all 3, you'll be at 20 stacks in total. These 20 stacks can then be used to empower your Shroud skills. The other 2 default utility skills are Blood is Power and Plague Lance. These are corruption skills, they will apply conditions to yourself when casting them. In return for that downside, they are typically really powerful. When done right, the self-applied conditions are not necessarily a downside though, because you can transfer them to enemies instead by going into Shroud or using Dagger 4. We're using the trait Plague Sending just for that. Blood's power is absolutely insane for damage. It applies might and a lot of long-lasting bleeding. The bleeding and torment applied to yourself can be transferred, as I said, for even more damage. Plague Lance is a condition bombing skill, since it applies pretty much every condition possible over time multiple times, but also applies poison and bleeding to yourself. Use these off cooldown, but only when you know you can cleanse the conditions off soon afterwards, because you might actually nuke yourself otherwise, or at least be stuck in combat for a while. For open world, I usually also run these utility choices with changed traits, unless I need a more resilient setup for soloing harder bosses or hero points. The easiest way to go for harder content is to slap on a bunch of minions instead of elixirs and Plague Lance, skip Shroud 3 and 4 because you don't have enough blight to be consumed, and swap a few trait choices. More on that later when we talk about traits and specializations though. A skill that is unique to Necromancer is Epidemic. Epidemic is also worth a mention here, since it will copy 5 stacks of conditions on the target to all enemies around it. This used to be way more powerful, but it's still a good tool to kill ads fast if you have multiple epidemics, for example on Mursat Overseer or Soulless Horror / Dismina. Moving on to gear and consumables. The gear on this build is pretty straightforward. But there are a few differences between the setup for Condition DPS and the Quickness / Open World variant. We're running full Viper, with just a few pieces of Ritualists in the Quickness Open World variant for some extra boon duration. There is no need to use anything else. All the survivability you might need can be obtained through trait choices. Most importantly, you'll want to reach 100% duration on Torment and Bleeding, since they are the largest contributors to your damage. We'll also be running Nightmare Runes, so you only need one set of gear aside from 3 additional weapons with Ritualist stats on them, 1 pistol, 1 focus, 1 dagger. For the Open World / Quickness variant, you can add in more Ritualist pieces through trinkets if you feel like you need more boon duration. Nightmare Runes provide a lot of condition damage and condition duration, which is ideal for this build. Nightmare Runes come from Twilight Arbor dungeon, so you have to do a few runs in there to gather up the tokens for them. A nice side effect of Nightmare Runes is that when using Plague Lance, one of the self-applied conditions will be transferred automatically, since the 45-second cooldown of the 6-piece effects from the rune fits pretty perfectly to Plague Lance with Alacrity up. What you also need is a Jadebot core, since that grants Vitality, and Vitality is converted to either Concentration or Expertise in this build. Ideally it'd be level 10, the higher the better. In terms of sigils, I usually run Malice and Torment in the DPS variant and Malice and Demons in the Open World / Quickness variant. You can ditch the Malice sigil if you have Expertise infusions and slap on a Bursting sigil instead, but it's not that big of a deal if you don't. You can also use condi damage infusions instead if you have them, the difference is minimal. In terms of consumable items, we'll want to run the Torment duration food plus condition damage. As utility, we'll be using the Toxic Focusing Crystal by default. If you can afford it, you can also use the Writ of Masterful Malice for a bit more condition damage on it. In the Quickness / Open World variant, I'm running the Expertise and condition damage food because the bleeding duration won't cap out otherwise. Now that you have an idea of the gear that we'll be using, we can talk about traits and specializations. We'll always be using Cursors and of course Harbinger. The default third option for both DPS and Quickness / Open World is Soul Reaping. If you need more survivability in open world, run Death Magic. Starting with Curses. Curses is a thoroughly great specialization for condi damage necros. It has increased bleeding duration, applying bleeding on critical hits, condition transfer and fury upon entering Shroud, reduced corruption recharge, crit chance increase for each condition on the foe, condi damage based on precision and even more condi damage. You should run the traits in the combination listed here for any kind of group content, but you can swap to Parasitic Contagion for open world if you want a decent amount of passive sustain at the cost of 200 condi damage. The second default option, Soul Reaping, is just as great. It improves your life force management a lot and empowers your Shroud skills. It makes Shroud auto attacks very loaded with vulnerability and burning, reduces recharge of Shroud skills, increases maximum life force, and also increases your damage by 10% upon entering or leaving Shroud through Soul Barbs. Especially Soul Barbs is a major staple in the rotation and the reason why we want to stay in and out of Shroud for around 10 seconds each, so we maintain a high uptime on this buff. More on that in the rotation section though. If you want to play a tanky build, the core specialization that you should replace is Soul Reaping. Using Death Magic makes you incredibly resilient through the buff effect Carapace, which grants 20 toughness per stack. You'll easily be able to maintain over 25 stacks of this in combat with the traits of choice, since you obtain one for each condition you apply. And you'll also gain pulsing protection while you maintain at least 25 of them. With the traits of choice, this amounts to a permanent 500 to 600 toughness in combat, and another 33% reduced incoming strike damage and 30% reduced incoming condition damage. It can't get much tankier than this, to be honest. Finally, we of course use Harbinger. The traits of choice in Harbinger for the condi DPS build empower the condition-based playstyle by granting more condi damage for every blight stack, reducing recharge on pistol skills and granting expertise based on your vitality. It will also pulse weakness and 3 stacks of torment around you every 3 seconds while you are in Shroud. You further gain life force when you enter Shroud and increased vitality and heal for every blight stack. All of this is very nice and makes it a unique playstyle that we're going to look at in the rotation. If you are playing solo or want to provide quickness to your subgroup, you only need to change 2 traits to the middle line. This way you gain a chunk of boon duration, AoE boons on elixirs and pulsing quickness and fury while in Shroud. And this brings me to the quickness generation. How to provide quickness on Harbinger? Well, providing quickness on Harbinger is very easy, you just do the same thing as before. Through Twisted Medicine and Deathly Haste, using the Elixir of Anguish and going to Shroud on cooldown will lead to a permanent uptime on it. In Shroud you supply pulsing quickness and fury around you with a base duration of 3 seconds every 3 seconds. Outside of Shroud you'll be using the Elixir of Anguish on cooldown to cover the downtime you otherwise have. It's that easy. The boon duration you need for this isn't really high, you only need around 20 to 25% to maintain it easily. The boon duration for the simplified rotation is even lower than in the benchmark rotation because you have a higher Shroud uptime due to a shorter overall rotation outside of Shroud. Speaking of rotations, let's move on to rotation guidance. The rotation here is very easy and more forgiving than the benchmark rotation, since it does not involve any forced weapon swaps and thus only consists of 1 Shroud loop and 1 pistol/focus loop. As I said before, Soul Barbs requires us to leave and enter Shroud within 10 seconds every time, and the rotation focuses on that while maximizing the Shroud uptime. For the opener, precast all 3 elixirs. Just be aware that the boons you gain will be removed, but Blight does not. Then use Plague Lance, Blood is Power, Pistol 2, Blood is Power and go into Shroud. This way we have all the big damage hits out and then can enter Shroud with a maximum amount of damage in it. Using Plague Lance first and then Blood is Power will immediately transfer one of the conditions to the enemy, with the other 2 following when you enter Shroud. In Shroud you want to do the same thing every time. You want to start with Shroud 2, then 4, 3, then 5 auto attacks, then cast 2 when it's ready, do another 5 auto attacks, then 4, 3 and 2. If you are in a situation where you cannot be in melee range, just use auto attacks and 2 on cooldown. Other than that, you just want to use all your skills aside from Focus 5 off cooldown in the regular rotation outside of Shroud. You want to cast Pistol twice outside of Shroud so you gain enough life force back. It's a good idea to use this as soon as possible so you have some wiggle room for the second cast. Make sure that the healing elixir is cast after the other 2 so you get the double duration on the poison it applies due to it consuming blight. Ideally, you'd use Blood is Power right before going into Shroud again so the conditions are transferred with the maximum duration and you can avoid having them cleansed by someone else before you can transfer them. You should be going into Shroud pretty much every time on cooldown unless you have 2 stacks of Blood is Power up and ready. The rotation is quite fast paced but very simple to execute. The only difficulty in it comes from Shroud skills 3 and 4, since they will launch you into melee range and thus can be dangerous to use at times. Remember that not using them will also make you retain more blight stacks, you'll be at a constant 25 stacks if you do so, meaning more condition damage amplifiers. So the trade-off isn't that huge if you can't use them in a loop or 2. You'll only lose around 10% damage for the time, so you can still do like 34 or 35k DPS that way even without them. With the quickness variant you should be able to reach around 31k DPS on the golem as well. Alright, that is it for today. Feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm. See you next time and happy blight collecting.